So now that we've got our project set up, let's go ahead and create a very simple test. We're just going to open up the Pluralsight homepage and we're going to verify that we got there. And we're just going to create this simple test to verify that our framework works and to see how the basic framework creation process works from within our tests. So we're inside of our test class here, and let's go ahead and make a test. We'll rename this test to can go to homepage. And the idea here is that we're just going to test that we can go to the Pluralsight homepage. So we're going to write this test first, and then we're going to implement the framework to make this test succeed. So this is a little bit backwards from how you might think about writing an automation framework, but I found that this is the best way to do this for two reasons. One, it makes sure that your API is simple and understandable, and two, it makes sure that you don't build more framework than you need. So we're going to start off by just creating an API that we want to use inside of our tests. And remember, we can't depend on Selenium here. So we're going to try to make this as plain English as possible, and we're not going to ever import Selenium. So let's go ahead and say pages.homepage.goto. And then let's go ahead and do assert is true, and we'll say pages.homepage.isAt. And so what we expect to happen here is that we're going to create this pages.homepage goto method, and it's going to go to the homepage of Pluralsight, and then we're going to check to see if we're at that page, and we're going to assert that that's true. So we'll go ahead and start by creating this pages class, and we need to create this pages class inside test framework. So let's go ahead and make sure we do it there. So we're going to add a new class, and we'll call this pages, and we're going to make this public and static. And you'll find that as we're working in the framework, the way that I like to build a framework is not the way that you should build traditional code. What I mean by this is that you typically wouldn't make everything static, but you'll find that there's this balance between simplifying the API and making the framework code itself subscribe to some of the best practices that you would use in a regular application. A framework for testing is a different type of application than any other type of application, so you don't want to try and build it like a standard application. So now that we have that pages, we need a home page. Now there's a couple ways we could do this. We could create a nested class, we could create a property, we could change our API at this point and say, oh, we don't really want to make it be pages.homepage. But in this case, let's just go ahead and create a nested class here. And this homepage class, we'll go ahead and make that static as well. And so far, we're okay with our API. Now this goto method, we'll need to create this as well. And we'll just go ahead and leave this unimplemented at this point. We'll come back and fix that later. First, let's get our API fleshed out here. So then we need to have this isAt method. So let's go ahead and create that as well. So now we have our test that should be able to run, and when we run this, it should throw an exception. So let's go ahead and run this test and see that it's going to fail. And it's failing because we don't have any implementation of this. It's just throwing an exception here. So let's go ahead and add our implementation. So goto, the way that we're going to do this is let's go ahead and imagine that we have a browser, a general purpose browser that's going to abstract away Selenium here. Now we could create a browser for each page, but if we did that, or if we put browser in here, we'd be mixing the concepts a little bit. So again, I'm going to drive this time from the framework to the deeper layers of the framework. So in order to implement goto, right now I think the simplest thing to do would be to say something like browser.goto and then specify a URL. And let's go ahead and just make this URL here, which will be a property on our class. So we'll go ahead and create a property called URL. We'll make this a read-only property. We'll make it a string, and this is going to be the URL of Pluralsight. In fact, we don't even really need this to be a property at this point. We could just really use a variable here. So let's make this even simpler. So we'll go ahead and make the URL be http://pluralsite.com. And we don't need to make this protected either. So now we need this browser object. So let's go ahead and create a browser class here. And we'll make this static as well. And we're going to move this out into its own file. And now, in order to implement this, we need a goTo method. So let's go ahead and create a goTo. And so now the implementation of this goTo is actually going to need to use Selenium. So let's give our browser class an instance of an WebDriver. So we'll call this the WebDriver. And let's go ahead and import this WebDriver. And then we'll set this equal to a new Firefox driver, just to keep things simple for now. We could make it so this implementation could use different types of drivers for IE or Chrome, but in this case, let's just use Firefox. So now in order to implement this goTo, it's just a matter of calling WebDriver.URL. But we do need to make WebDriver static in order to access it from this static method. And so now we should be able to just call WebDriver.URL and set the URL equal to the URL that's passed in. So now we have goTo implemented. And let's move this URL up here. And then we need to implement an isAt. So let's go ahead and implement this with our browser object also. We'll say browser.title should be equal to, and this will be what the title of this page is. So let's go ahead and define a static string here, and we'll call this page title, and this should be Pluralsight hardcore developer training, since that's the title of the homepage of Pluralsight. So now we're just going to check to make sure that the title is equal to our page title. We'll go ahead and return that. And then we need to implement this title property. So let's go ahead and create a property title on our browser here. And we'll just make a getter for this. And we'll make it use the WebDriver. So we'll say WebDriver.title. We're just going to return that. So now we have everything implemented for our test. And you can see when we look at our unit test here that our unit test is very simple. It just calls goTo and then it asserts that it is at. Now, we might not have done everything the most efficient way here. When you look at this pages here, you can see that if we have multiple pages, we're going to have a goTo and an isAt for each page. So we might create a higher level structure that has a goTo implementation and an isAt. And we're duplicating a few things here. We're basically chaining some method calls. So we're basically passing the goTo right to the browser, and the isAt, we're using the title that's really existing on WebDriver. But that's okay because we're trying to create a layer of abstraction. We're trying to separate our tests from Selenium as much as possible. So now let's go ahead and run this test. We're just going to do run unit tests. And you should see Firefox show up here. And it's going to pluralsight.com training. And it's actually leaving this web page open. So this is a bit of an issue here. But you can see that we did succeed here. So the test still thinks it's running, and that's because it created a new Firefox instance and it never closed it. So once I close this, you can see that it finishes. So we need to account for that as well. So let's go ahead and create another method here. We're going to call this clean up. And inside here, we're going to call browser.close. And then we'll make sure that this is a test cleanup method. And we'll implement browser.close now. So browser.close is just simply going to call WebDriver.close. So now let's go ahead and run our test. And you can see Firefox pops up. We go to Pluralsight, we verify the title, and we close it. So now we've successfully proved out our framework and our test. And that's how we're going to work to develop our test, is using this basic technique that we did here for the simple test.